So thanks for joining us for our second fireside chat to honor Alcohol Awareness Month. We introduced ourselves the first time, but just to review names, I'm Rebecca Troop. I work at Seacoast Mental Health Center, and I'm a woman in long-term recovery. Diane?
And I'm Diane Fontenot, the Seacoast Mental Health Center SUD Program Manager, and also a person in long-term recovery.
And I'm John Burns with SOS Recovery Community Organization, and I'm also a person in long-term recovery, as well as a family member of recovery.
Yeah. And I think, and you say, and also a family member, and that is true for myself as well, probably for many, many people. And as we talk about that continuum of drinking and recognizing that it takes a village and it takes a family, and one of the most probably lonely times for people is when they're trying to decide, where am I? Is alcohol really a problem for me, or are other substances really a problem for me? And people around me may be saying, gee, you really ought to cut back, or you've had a DUI, or you've lost a job, or these things are not great at work. Wherever you're at in thinking about this, I think one of the common things that we see is that they may have an ultimatum from friends or family that, you can't drink around here like that, or you can't behave like that, or we can't have you over here if you're drinking. Or if you start to hear some of those things, that might be a key that things are becoming problematic. And people tend to really spend a lot of time in their head with this battle of, yeah, I should quit, but I don't really think I need to quit yet. Or do I, is this really a problem? And I've heard a lot of people say, I went in to seek treatment and really thought, oh, I've overreacted. I'm not like all the rest of them, and it's really not that bad. Just to spend maybe the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years going further down the rabbit hole to come back up and go, okay, now I really am ready. So I think helping people identify what is the continuum of drinking is really different for everybody, but some of what that looks like, it may be helpful for people.
And it's so, from me, speaking from my experience and from talking to so many women and just people that I know, and really observing a ton of it since the pandemic started, is there's the comparison and stigma and the continuum of drinking for me personally is very intertwined. Because there's the comparison is sort of like, well, I'm not how I view somebody who has a drinking concern is like, or someone who has a substance use disorder problem is like, but maybe my drinking's not healthy. Maybe it's in this early part for, when I started, where it's like all of a sudden it's just more in your head, and that's different for different people. But if it becomes the center of something, like, well, obviously at my 4-year-old's birthday party, of course we're going to be serving wine and beer. Why would we not? Well, why would you? And that's just a kind of a small goofy example, but there's sort of talking about it from the perspective of recovery and talking about it from the perspective of daily life, which is so many people right now. I mean, the stat just came out recently that since the difference between 2019 and 2020 with women and drinking and being home with the pandemic, it's up 50%. And I know in the state of New Hampshire, the alcohol sales have skyrocketed. So there's this enormous, referring to something John said in our last session, of this enormous population historically in our country that doesn't identify. We can't determine who's in recovery. There's so many people right now that are probably having problematic, concerning drinking and are really in that mental battle that you mentioned, Diane, which really is an awful space.
Yeah. It is really awful.
I agree. I think, being able to trying to identify, it's, and it's so normalized, like problematic drinking is normalized. Mm-hmm. So what people have, I know for myself in recovery, I was in sales before I got into this work, and I was in sales management, and it was not uncommon. I mean, it's still not uncommon to hear like, "Oh, you're not going to have a drink? You don't know what you're missing." Like, which for somebody who's just diving into the possibility of recovery, to face that regularly from their peers of like, when you like, why aren't you having a drink? Like having to answer that question is like, I mean, it's there's sometimes I'm exhausted by it still today. Like, why do you care?
Yeah, and I do hear a lot of people hesitate from wanting to identify as having an alcohol use disorder, or even committing to not drinking in some circumstances, because the idea of going out with friends and not ordering alcohol is going to somehow shine this tremendous spotlight on them. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you drinking? And put them in a position to automatically be scrutinized. And it doesn't always happen. Sometimes people don't even notice if you order ginger ale, you know, but people are really afraid of being questioned and scrutinized for not drinking. Yet when they do drink, they can't always determine when they will stop, how they'll get home, or what that'll look like at the end of the night. And people don't really question that. Oh, it was a wild weekend, and this is just what we do after we work hard all week. And they don't really question the things, the outcomes, and the consequences, and the detrimental outcomes to what happens to them and their family, and from drinking. But yet, to question that I might not have a drink is too much to bear. And that's the stigma, that's the society piece that we grow up with.
Yeah, I mean, I often tell people if they are feeling like socially they still need that social connection where alcohol is going to be, and they feel like they can manage it. I'm constantly giving the record, like, go get a seltzer water with lemon or lime. You won't have to hear it as much. It looks like a drink.
Yeah, something that looks like a drink.
Say that, but like, hopefully you like seltzer water or tonic water. Get one of those with a lime or lemon in it, and you're less likely to have to face the questions, and at least
Right?
you can function and not feel like you're under that scrutiny. But
Any drink, and have them toss a cherry in it.
yeah, yeah. So, but I think, understanding where that continuum is still, how do you identify it in terms of like, and I always say like, well, are you finding yourself facing disciplinary actions at work because you're constantly late, and whether they know that's because of of alcohol consumption that's constantly happening every night or not. So, start to look at some of those things. And if you feel like it's starting to affect where you're putting employment at risk, or you're finding yourself, arrested for DWI, or different things like that that are starting to become unmanageable for your life or your health, and your doctor is identifying things, like those are the areas that I always try to tell people, like, look at those things and try to be honest with yourself about it. And then if you start to identify too many of those problems, then it might be time to explore a different approach.
What I, for me, prior to getting to that point, kind of this gray area of, because like at that point, like I know, at least for me, it's sort of like at a point came when like I knew, like I knew that something was not right. And the difference between that and then finally entering recovery was like this huge chunk of time. That was my journey. But there was this huge phase coming up to it. And all in that phase, what I say now to people that I'm talking with is it prevalent in your head? The average person who doesn't have any type of issue with it or problematic relationship with alcohol doesn't think about when they're going to do it, how they're going to do it, if they need to have it there. If they have an insulated cup, nobody can see, like all these things where when I look back, it was this crazy amount of exhausting effort for probably a couple years before one would have ever identified health or legal or job or, I'm forgetting commitments I made for my kids, things like that, and so now when I've had, people that I know come up to me saying, do you think that I have a problem with my drinking? I said, well, how much of your day would you say you think about it? How much of a concern is it for you? Or do you honestly not care, but maybe when you drink, you may then have some sort of, like, maybe you drink too much every time. Well, then that's a different potential conversation. So it is complicated, but I guess my question to the two of you, because the two of you work with individuals much more closely than I do, is when should someone try and raise their hand? When do they start having, like, what are if you had to leave somebody with a couple tips of, at what point do I say, and what do I do?
So I would say one of the things that I like to ask people, whether it's alcohol or other substances, because people will say, I haven't lost my job, I haven't lost my license, I still get up and function every day. And yeah, some days I might be hungover. And they say, I can drink just fine. I can function just fine while I'm drinking. Or I can function just fine if I smoke pot every day. Okay, can you function without it? And think about that. If it was suddenly not there, could you still function without it? And that might be an indicator that you need to think about, how much do I rely on this really to function? Because eventually that will tip. that boat will capsize eventually, where it won't provide you the ability to function. It will take away the ability to function if you follow that continuum. What do you think, John?
Yeah, that's a great approach, I think, is to kind of look at it from that lens. And then I think, from there, you can start to identify where you might be able to get some info. So, are you open to the possibility of speaking to a behavioral health provider to, like, just talk about it? Like, no one's going to force you to do anything. Or if you have peers that you might know, or of, like recovery community organizations, anything like that, or even your, depending on your primary care doctor, some are more educated on this than others, but having somebody that you can reach out to that's familiar with this work to kind of have an open and honest conversation, and somebody that you feel safe won't be judgmental about it.
This is something that, we want to spend some time talking to folks next time about the recovery process, kind of what is it like? Is there a recovery process? I'm happy to share some of mine, and just really, and what resources specifically. And there's so many around the Seacoast right now, and in New Hampshire in general, of different types that, we'll share that in our next session with people who, they do want to raise their hand at any point in the continuum.